Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you guys the viewer overlay, which allows you to visually edit your videos in various ways inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. So when you have the viewer overlay enabled, and your preview window on either the cut page or the edit page of Resolve is going to show some controls which you can actually use to edit. So to enable the viewer overlay, you can either click on this box in the bottom left hand corner of the preview window, which will enable it or disable it. Alternatively, you can use the keyboard shortcuts for that, which is Shift and then tilde. So the tilde key is usually right below the escape key. It kind of looks like an apostrophe. So if you hit those two keys in combination, it's going to toggle the viewer overlay on and off. So the viewer overlay, when you have it on, comes in 5 different modes, which is Transform, Crop, Dynamic Zoom, OpenFX Overlay, and then Annotations. So we'll talk about each of those a little bit in this video. So first off, the Transform Viewer Overlay. You can see a lot of controls on the screen, including a white box which goes around your currently selected video clip. So the white box essentially represents the boundaries of the clip you have currently selected. And then these white circles you see at each of the corners and halfway between the corners allow you to stretch and control the size of your clip. So if we left click on one of the halfway points, it's going to stretch one dimension of the clip. So in this case, we're shrinking the zoom X, and you can see in the inspector that this value is reflected there as well. So if we were to increase the value in the inspector by left clicking on the property and dragging it, we would get essentially the same effect. This is just the visual way of achieving that. So if you want to stretch both the X and Y at the same time, then instead you would click on one of the corners and drag that inwards or outwards. So you can see that when we have the corners selected, that the X and Y are linked together. So it's going to maintain the aspect ratio, which is generally going to be important for making it look right. If you don't scale the X and Y together, things are going to look stretched in weird ways. So in addition to that, you have this handle coming out of the center area, which allows you to adjust the rotation of your clip. So if we left click on this, a circle will appear, and we can rotate around the circle 360 degrees, and we can technically go beyond that as well. So if you had keyframing set up, you could make a clip rotate 2, 3 full revolutions just by going like this around in a circle. Now, if you don't already know, in order to set up a keyframe, you just need to click on the gray diamond to the right of any property in the inspector. So if we say set a rotation angle here of 0 at this point in the timeline, we can go a little bit further on. And now if we rotate it, it's going to create another keyframe. You can see in the inspector that the keyframe diamond is automatically turned red, since this clip already has a timeline keyframe for that property. And now if we go back and hit play, we get that rotation effect as it animates over that couple of seconds. Okay, in addition to those settings, there's also the anchor point, which exists at the very center of the screen by default. So if we left click on this middle circle and drag it around, you'll see the anchor point property gets adjusted. And when we're talking about the anchor point, we're talking about what should be considered the center for all of the effects we're going to create. So if we rotate now, it's going to rotate around that anchor point rather than rotating around the center of the screen. So the anchor is in the center of the screen by default, but if you move that out of the way, then that changes where it rotates around. And that also affects other settings like zooming. Instead of zooming from the center of the screen, it's going to be zooming in and out from that anchor point. Now, when we move the anchor point, you'll also see one more giant circle dot in the center of the screen. So this one that lies underneath is actually just the control for moving the clip around the screen. So if we left click on this, we basically have the whole clip selected as something that we can move. So this is going to adjust the position property. And basically we can just move the clip to whatever corner we need it to be in. If you want, you can scale down your zoom. And if we put this in a corner, that could be one way of doing a picture-in-picture effect if you had another video clip to go in this black space. So that's the transform tools. Let's start over with a fresh clip and go down to the crop controls. So the crop section of the viewer overlay, it allows you to take the edges of the screen and cut them away so that they aren't included in the final video. So if I left click on any of these sides and I drag it inwards, you'll see that it basically pulls in the side, leaving nothing behind but black space. And rather than scaling the video, it just cuts away from part of the video. So if we only wanted to show like the center area here, we could left click and drag in on all of the sides. You can crop the top like this and the bottom like this. And then instead of shrinking the video, we just selectively choose what is going to show through. So cropping can also be found in the inspector. If you double click this cropping property here, you can see all of the changes that we've made to this. Cropping can also be done with softness. So if you don't want a hard edge on the sides of this video clip now, you can increase the softness, which is going to take everything outside of that bounds and blur it between darkness and the original video clip as well. So next up is dynamic zoom. When we go to dynamic zoom mode, you're going to see two boxes on your clip. So the red one is the end point of the zoom, and then the green one is the starting point. And the starting point with dynamic zoom is going to be set to the beginning of your clip, and the red box is to the end of the clip. So if you wanted to change the duration of the zoom, you would need to make a cut in your timeline. So for instance, if I went about here and I made a cut, and then on this left clip that has now been separated from the rest of the stuff on the right, I can enable dynamic zoom there and have a zoom occur from this starting point to the end point. And then the second part of the clip doesn't have to have dynamic zoom. So we can just leave dynamic zoom disabled for that part. So that's how you would control where the dynamic zoom goes onto and the duration for it. Now for the zoom itself, you can change the boxes here. So as I mentioned before, red is the endpoint. So if you wanted the dynamic zoom to zoom in on your clip, then you would want to shrink this box inwards towards the center area of the clip. So while you're working and editing your dynamic zoom, you can still see the entire clip as it was originally. But then as soon as we hit play, it goes to that zoomed in mode. Now when the green box is like this, even at the start of the clip, it's going to be partially zoomed in. So if we wanted to start from full 100% zoom, then we just need to make this box match the bounds of the clip. And at this point, it's going to start completely zoomed out at its normal zoom and then zoom into this red box. So let's just go ahead and hit play, and you can see how over time it gets more and more zoomed in. So likewise, if you want a reverse of that, you can have it be zoomed in a lot at the start, and then you can have it zoom out by pulling the red box and making it go to the full screen size. And now if we hit play, it's going to start very zoomed in, and it's going to zoom out gradually. Now one other thing you can do with dynamic zoom is to add an ease curve to it. So if we open the dynamic zoom in the inspector, you can see by default it's set to dynamic zoom ease linear, which means it's going to have a constant speed of the zooming. But if you want it to be slow at the start, then you can set it to ease in. You can have it be slow at the end by making it ease out. And you can have it slow at the beginning and the end by making it ease in and out. So when you make one part of your zoom slow, by default, the other parts are going to be faster. So with it set to ease in and out, the middle is going to be faster because the left and right ends of the zoom are going to be slower. So at the end of the day, it's still the same zoom, just with a different timeline for how fast it goes at each second. So if we hit play at the start here, you can see it's really slow at the beginning, but then it speeds up in the middle. And when we get to the end, the zoom slows down again. Okay, so that's basically dynamic zoom. So OpenFX overlay is going to allow you, with certain OpenFX that you add onto your video clip, to modify the settings by clicking and dragging around items that will appear on the screen when you have those OpenFX. So for instance, if we go to Effects Library and I find OpenFX and we go down here to light rays, I can drag this onto the clip, which will make light rays appear from a certain direction. But if we zoom out with light rays added to the clip, you can see that there is this little icon here indicating the position where the light rays should be coming from. So if we left click on this now and we drag it around, it controls the direction of the light rays. So we can have the light come from the bottom and then go upwards. We can have it come from the right and go inwards towards the left, or we can have it come from up above like a sun, and the light rays can come down. So the gizmo only allows us in this case to control that position. Other options we could go to OpenFX for and change the settings here. So depending on which effect you add onto your clip, it's going to give you different gizmos that you can play around with and control visually with the viewer overlay. And everything else you can just modify in the inspector as well. Okay, and then lastly, annotations. So when you want to draw a note onto your screen at a certain frame that doesn't show up in the final render but is purely for editing, then you can do that with annotations. So when you're in annotation mode, let's zoom in here a little bit. We get a freehand pen tool by default. There's also a arrow tool, a line tool, and a rectangle tool. And we can control the color of whatever we're going to draw on the screen by clicking on this dropdown. But the idea is that we just pick a frame and we draw whatever we need to indicate possibly what should be for an edit, what areas need to be modified. that kind of stuff. So we could like circle this light here and make some note of it. You'll notice that when we do create the annotation, that a marker is added to the clip of the timeline to go along with that. So the annotation information is actually embedded into the marker itself. So if we double click on the marker, you can see there's a toggle here now for annotations. So if we didn't have annotation mode created, we could click on this in order to go view the annotations for that marker. If we want to add like some text to this annotation to actually make mention of what it's supposed to be, so we could say something like this circled area is too bright, and we can change the color of the annotation to something relevant to us or the people we're working with. Go ahead and hit OK. And now in combination, we have a timestamp that we can click on, a note about what that marker means. And so if we want to change the note for that marker and indicate what it actually means, we can double click on the marker and give it a name. So in this case, maybe the circled area is too bright. If we have annotations attached to a marker, because you can create markers without annotations, then it's going to indicate that with this little annotation symbol over here. We can also change the color of the marker just by clicking down there and hit done. So now anytime we're jumping around our timeline and we want to go back and remember something we were needing to edit, then those little notes, we can just go to that frame. We can see the name of the annotation. And if you prefer, you can separate the note from the name of it itself. So you could add the notes down here if you have to write too much stuff. And that's the basic idea of how you can use the annotations there. So a couple other things to note: whenever you make an annotation, you can left click on it and you can drag it around. So if you've used the pen tool on other programs, it kind of works like that. Or it's sort of like this path you can just manipulate around your screen. We can also switch to the arrow tool and draw arrows as we need. So any of these items we've added to our annotation, we can change the color on by left clicking on it, which highlights it, and then click on the drop down, change the color. So we can go over here and change the color of the arrow as well. So let's make that a blue. And for the freehand pen, we can left click on the drop down, and we can also change the thickness of the line. So this applies to ones you have already created and have selected, or to any you want to create in the future. So when you have one selected and you want to deselect it, you can just click away from it, where you get the kind of pen tool with the minus sign. So now we don't have any selected, and we can just draw a new one over here and left click it again, change the color with the drop down menu. And that's the basic idea of how you can do annotations. Now there's one limitation of this, which is that it is kind of hard to like write notes like this. Like if you wanted to, say, start writing on the screen, like technically you can do it, but if you try to click too close to one of the lines you've already created and let go of, it's kind of going to get in the way. So it's probably better to actually put your text in the name of the marker or the notes of the marker itself rather than trying to write on the screen. I guess an exception might be if you're going to write in cursive, so you could do something like this if you really wanted to. That's basically a quick 2-minute overview of annotations. So one last thing I want to show you is that most of these functions that exist on the viewer overlay and the edit page, you can also find over on the cut page. So when you're on the cut page and you have a clip selected, you can click on this little tools icon in order to open some of those same options up. So we have transform over here on the left. We can click on transform. And then in the same way, we get those viewer overlay tools appearing on the screen. So we can stretch the video. We can rotate it around as well. All those same tools. We also have access to crop. So we can cut away the sides. You also notice that there is the softness setting here. So in this case, you don't need the inspector on this side. And then over here on the right, you have dynamic zoom working exactly how it does on the edit page as well. Note that rather than using the inspector to change the ease curve of it, you can just select from these 4 icons that appear here. So if you want to go back to a linear zoom, you can just click linear there and you're good to go. There's also 3 presets you can start with. So if you want to go back to a default zoom, you can click on the zoom preset. There's also pan preset over here. So with the dynamic zoom, you can actually change the position of the boxes as well. So if we left click on the box and we drag it around, you can have it not only zoom in or zoom out, but you can actually adjust the position of the shot, what it's looking at, by having it move from one corner of the original to the top left-hand corner, if you so choose. There's also angle preset, which basically does what I just did, where you can have it go from one corner to the other corner. Note that whenever you do the panning, that it will indicate with a line how it's going to pan across your shot. So every so many frames, it'll just give you a little dot indicating where it's at. And if we change the ease curve, such as ease in and out, you'll see that at the start, those keyframe points are closer together, but at the middle part, it's further apart, indicating that across the same number of frames, it basically speeds up and it makes more distance in a shorter period of time. And then lastly, if you have any OpenFX added to your clips, but you're over on the cut page and you want to change some of their properties, you can click on the far right icon and hit Open Inspector, which will open the inspector for the OpenFX that you've added to your video clips, so you can change the properties over here. However, when you have the OpenFX opened over here in the inspector on the cut page, it doesn't give you access to move around the gizmos like it does on the edit page. So in a nutshell, that is pretty much everything you need to know about the viewer overlay inside of DaVinci Resolve as a useful tool that gives you access to various gizmos for controlling your clips and adjusting the properties without relying on the inspector. So if you feel that you would like to edit more visually rather than just manually changing numbers all the time in the inspector, then this can be a really helpful tool for you. So that's pretty much going to be it for this video. I've been Chris. Hope this helped you out, and I will see you guys in my future video content.